This is MichMash, a weekly conversation where we try to unjumble an important and sometimes under-the-radar statewide story that affects you. I'm Alethia Kasben.
And I'm Zach Gorchow.
Zach, we are dusting off the Gongwer budget shutdown clock this week. As of today, Friday, September 5th, there are 25 days remaining for the legislature and Governor Gretchen Whitmer to complete a budget before the new fiscal year starts and avoid the first state government shutdown in 16 years.
Yes, Gongwer subscribers can get excited for that shutdown clock to appear on their headlines, gongwer.com. Check it out. But yes, things are getting edgy around the state capitol, and that pressure will only continue to intensify. The group right now raising the biggest stink about the inability of the Democratic governor, Republican state house, and Democratic state senate to finish a budget is the K-12 public schools community, right? Alethia, why do the schools seem to be in more of a yank than anyone else right now?
So it all goes back to school districts having begun their fiscal year on July 1st, which is more than 2 months ago now, without a clear indication of how much money the state will appropriate. So they took their best guess based on what the governor proposed in February, what the Senate passed in May, and the House passed in June, but it's just a guess.
So some school districts, amid the uncertainty, are laying off support staff or even saying some non-educational programming, like the free breakfast and lunch program for all students, not just the neediest, will not continue this year.
So some of the stalemate is about the differences on K through 12, but a lot of it is more about the budget overall, right?
Indeed. The House Republican version of the K-12 budget was a dramatic departure. It compiled nearly all the money for schools into a flexible grant instead of providing that more traditional basic grant, plus earmarked funds for programs that some districts might receive money for and some might not. The budget the governor proposed and the budget the Senate Democratic majority passed is more of the traditional model, which has the basic funds plus the earmarked funds.
But Representative Tim Kelly, the Republican who chairs the K through 12 budget in the House, also has made it clear that his spending plan was highly unlikely to be what the final budget looked like. The schools here are caught up in more of the overall budget stalemate and the question about tying a road funding plan to the budget rather than the particulars about how the state should fund schools.
So one thing to keep in mind is that while state government functions would go into a partial shutdown at 12:01 a.m. October 1 without an approved budget at the start of the fiscal year, schools should have enough funding to keep going longer. The bigger pressure point for them is about October 20th. That's roughly when the state would make the next of its 11 payments during the school year to school districts. If the state is still in a shutdown by then, that's when the schools could really start to face a cash crunch.
And if the state is still in a shutdown 3 weeks after the fiscal year started, well, it's not just going to be the schools who are miserable.
Yeah, let's not even go there. Now that we've set the table on how the budget stalemate is rippling through the state schools, we're going to dive even deeper. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, our guest is going to discuss how many of the state school superintendents are responding to this growing crisis. Stick around, we'll be right back. Welcome back. Joining us now is Bob McCann. He's Executive Director of the K-12 Alliance of Michigan. That's an organization of school superintendents in Macomb, Oakland, Wayne, Genesee, Monroe, and St. Clair counties. Bob's a longtime figure on the Capitol scene. He's been a top staffer for state Senate Democrats and a spokesperson for the state's Environment Department. In fact, Bob and I first got to know each other 24 years ago when I covered his campaign for the State House, a race won by someone named Gretchen Whitmer. Bob, welcome to MichMash.
Thanks, Zach. Nice having me here.
So, Bob, the organization you lead represents superintendents in about 30% of the districts in the state. School districts' fiscal year began on July 1st, as you know. But as you also know, there is no state budget in place, even as all Michigan schools return to classes this week. So what is the biggest challenge right now?
It's the lack of certainty that any school district is working with right now. You know, obviously, normally schools put their budgets together in June. And while it's not necessarily uncommon that a final state budget isn't done at that point, they usually have a fairly good representation of what that budget is ultimately going to look like, because we've seen a House budget passed, we've seen a Senate budget passed, we're in conference committees, we know where the discussions are going. And so generally they can plan that, well, we might not know exactly what the budget looks like, but we have a pretty good idea. We can move forward with our own planning for the upcoming school year and have a pretty good idea that we're going to be right. They might have to make some adjustments when they get back, but largely speaking, they understand what resources they're going to have available to the upcoming year. This year, they have none of that. They have a Senate budget that was passed a few months ago. They have a part of a House budget that was passed a few months ago. They have a newer House budget that was just passed last week that it put some more pieces together. But ultimately, those two budgets don't look anything like each other. They're vastly different in terms of how they would allocate money to any given school district, which means that if a school were to look at one versus the other, you might be talking, upwards of $1 million, $2 million, $3 million in differences of what those two budgets would provide them. So that gives them no ability to plan for the upcoming school year with any certainty that they're going to have the funds that they think they need available to them. And what that's meant, unfortunately, is a scaling back of services, at least to start the school year, that they would have wanted to provide our students, whether that's hiring reading coaches, tutors, whatever that may be, or cutting back on contractual services. We've seen schools already announce that they're not going to have the free meal program available this year. Those are the real world consequences of what the failures here in Lansing are meaning in classrooms across the state.
So you've touched on something important, which is that the House, led by the Republicans, and the Senate, led by the Democrats, the budgets they've passed are very different, very, very different from each other. The Senate Democrats, more of a traditional budget. House Republicans sort of lumping most of the funding into one pot, just let districts figure it out. But the Republicans have said in response to the schools saying, hey, we're going to have to make cuts, or some of these cuts that are happening, the per pupil amount in each of the three budgets from the governor, the House, and the Senate are all pretty close. So why are you all, making these, pretty serious decisions to cut services? Can you answer that question?
Because I think that shows a lack of understanding of how school funding works in general. The school budget is far more than the per pupil allotment. That works as a base level, but as you know, Zach, a school budget is built on a series of funding pots of money that ultimately make up the entirety. And that includes things like special education funding, at-risk funding, other types of program funding that individual school districts may need to dip into more than their neighboring district. If you are a district that has a higher proportion of at-risk students or special education students, you're obviously going to get more of that funding in the state budget, because that's how school funding is supposed to work. The money is supposed to follow the need. That's how the School Finance Research Collaborative, a nonpartisan group of experts, recommended the state follow. It's the model that they've been adopting more and more in recent school budgets. And the House budget doesn't recognize that. It simply lumps it all and pretends that every student essentially costs the same amount of money to educate. And that isn't the case. And unfortunately, what that would mean is that while some districts would benefit from that in many ways, other districts would significantly lose out. Other students in particular would lose out. Students that rely on those services, they may not be available to that district anymore if they aren't receiving the funding for it. And so unfortunately, while yes, you can look at a piece of paper and say, well, we're giving you overall the totals amount to the same amount of money, but that doesn't mean that any given school district is going to get the money that they need to educate their students. And that's the unfortunate part of where we're still sitting here in September now. This is a conversation we would have been more than happy to have with the House back in January and February. We're never going to suggest that the model that Michigan uses for school funding is perfect and shouldn't be adjusted. That's not true by any means, but we can't be having these types of discussions about radically changing how to fund Michigan schools in September when schools are already back in session and educating kids. This would be disastrous for Michigan schools going forward if suddenly they made these types of radical changes when schools are already in.
So let's suppose for a moment that, October 1st comes and goes and the legislature doesn't, pass a budget. And unlike in previous shutdowns, there isn't a quick fix. So schools get their last per pupil or last big payment from the state on October 20th. Is that the point when there would be a cash crisis for schools? Sort of what does it look like if October 1st comes and goes without a budget?
Yeah, it's going to really start calling some serious questions into play here in terms of our schools' ability to continue operating at that point. Obviously, schools have certain amounts of fund balances that they have, and some districts may be able to continue making payroll, may continue making contractual payments to vendors and things like that beyond that, but that's not going to be universal. And there are going to be, some significant consequences at that point, unfortunately. We're hearing, these conversations are already being had between school districts and the Department of Education. They're telling us they're not sure how long it will take. Let's say there is a short-term budget shutdown in October. They're not sure how long it would take for them to get the money from Treasury and be able to be ready to send that out to districts on October 20th, even if a deal gets done in October. So, we're talking real consequences out there already, and those are going to get much, much more significant the longer this plays out. And absolutely, if this goes into October and there is even a short-term budget shutdown, there's already serious concerns being raised internally by departments, by schools about how quickly the money can still flow at that point.
So hypothetically, if there were some type of protracted shutdown that lasts several weeks and a payment to school districts from the state, the one that goes out about October 20th, is in jeopardy, could districts turn to their fund balances to keep the doors open, try to get through a few more weeks, or is that really not a viable option?
I don't think there's going to be a universal answer to that question. I think the greatest compliment I can always pay the superintendents that I work with is that they find a way. They're always working to figure out how they can best support their students, their teachers, their staffs. That's what they're doing right now. They are all working in conditions that they shouldn't have to, that, no leader of any organization should be running their organization without any idea of what funding they have available. You wouldn't suggest that would be, a CEO of a company would never run a business that way. And yet that's what we're forcing on our superintendents right now. And so they're finding a way to make it work, but it's going to get harder and harder to do that. And yes, if we start getting into October and the state payment is actually becoming in jeopardy, I don't have a good answer as to how they're going to overcome that. Some districts have fund balances that they assuredly will dip into and again, make it work as best as they can, because that's what's best for kids. Having kids in classrooms with every support available to them is what's best for kids. And they're going to try to make that work. But there's probably going to be some districts that either don't have the fund balance or just otherwise can't get everything in place to make that work. And that means there's going to be some real serious consequences at that point. But it's going to vary by district. It's going to vary by circumstance. There's no one size fits all answer to that question.
So what would those consequences be for schools that don't have a fund balance? Like, would schools close if there's a long, protracted shutdown?
I can't say for certain, but if you can't make payroll, if you can't be paying your bus services, if you can't be, paying for your security staff, what are you expecting them to do at that point? So, it really becomes less of a question and more just a reality check at that point for some districts. I'm sure that I don't have money in my accounts to pay these things. What are you expecting me to do at this point?
Your organization and others that are in the traditional public school sphere have expressed frustration at attempts to tie the budget to road funding. So what's the problem with tying the two together? And when you hear Governor Whitmer say there's no resolution on the budget without a resolution on roads, what do you think?
I question why. I mean, that's the simple reality of it. There's no reason to tie road funding to a school budget unless you're trying to take money from one to pay for the other. And unfortunately, that seems to be what's happening here. We've seen proposals put on paper that do exactly that, whether it's, just a straight withdrawal of $1.2 billion like the House Republicans had in a budget bill annually to put in I believe they called it an education reserve fund, except that's not what it was. It was to pay for roads. We've heard other proposals like, once again, trying to raid the teacher retirement system to pay for it, or otherwise, just get rid of the sales tax on gas without a real backfill for schools put in place. These are all ways to pay for a roads plan, but you're ultimately doing so on the backs of our school kids and the generations of them going forward. And, what we wanted to tell people is, look, we support the idea of more money in our roads. Our school buses take a beating every morning and every afternoon as they are bringing kids to school and bringing them back home. That means additional repair costs for districts or additional costs in contracting those services. But, at the end of the day, we're not willing to say that that money should be paid for out of our schools. Our schools have been a piggy bank for legislators to dip into for far too long. And it's time that we, at least in my opinion, stand up and say enough, that this is not an opportunity for them to say, we're just going to dip in a little bit further into that school aid fund to make a road plan work for us. So yeah, we did a poll of Michigan residents just to see where their heads were at, make sure that, we're not on the wrong side here. And it turns out we're not. That 80% of voters agree that school funding is a higher priority for them than road funding is. And more than that, 89% of voters say that they would be opposed to any plan that dips into the school aid fund to pay for roads. So this isn't something that the Michigan voters want. This is something that they are opposed to. And yet our lawmakers are still sitting here in Lansing holding a school budget hostage because they want to get a road funding deal done. And I just can't emphasize enough how much damage that is already doing to our public schools and how much damage it will continue to do the further this goes along.
So I want to touch on the sales tax on fuel purchases. So removing the paying of that tax when you buy gas is, something the House Republicans have put a plan forth to do. Governor Whitmer has said that she supports this. Is there a way that you could take that tax off of fuel and hold schools harmless? That is something that we hear with all these proposals, right? They're like, we want to remove the sales tax, but we're going to hold schools harmless. Is that a real thing?
Hold harmless loses any meaning when they use the school aid fund as a reserve fund, essentially, to pay for other things. We see every year, you can say hold harmless, and that may protect the money coming into the school aid fund, but then they just pull it out on the back end every year in terms of transferring money from the school aid fund to the general fund. So it really loses any meaning as long as they do that. So if there's a conversation that they want to put on the table that would truly protect that funding and truly keep money that, frankly, the taxpayers send to Lansing with the expectation that it's going to be used for schools and ensure that that's what it's all used for, we would be happy to have those conversations. But, just a wink and a nod that we're going to hold you harmless in this, it doesn't carry a whole lot of water with schools anymore. They've seen, every superintendent, every educator has seen this happen over and over again, where they say, we will hold you harmless. And then we see something happen in the budget that just reverses that money right back out the door. So no.
Governor Whitmer had some comments in the State of the State that certainly grabbed my attention. I think surprised a lot of people when she said, schools keep receiving more and more funding from the state and the educational results don't get better. When you heard that, what did you think?
Schools, it can be technically true that schools have more money in a year-to-year basis than they did the year before. But what can also be true is that the state is massively underfunding public education and has been for decades now. If you look at where we should be versus just even on an inflationary basis versus where we are funding our schools, we are billions of dollars behind just even keeping up with that inflationary level. Even just look at the last few years at the rise of inflation, our costs have skyrocketed in our schools and funding has not kept up. It hasn't even come close to keeping up. So this idea that we are putting more money in our schools is really a fallacy to begin with, number one. And number two, I would say, everybody in Lansing needs to look in the mirror once in a while and ask themselves what is going on to help our students. And ultimately, you can look in Lansing right now and say, well, number one, you're refusing to pass a budget. you're harming schools, you're harming the education level of our kids right now. So if there is a crisis in public education in Michigan, it's not in the classroom, it's in the Capitol building, and that needs to be accounted for, and they need to be held accountable when they are the cause of it. So unfortunately, I disagree with the governor wholeheartedly in that comment. And I think it's ultimately time that we start not only looking at these failures in budgeting in Lansing to really provide our schools with the funding that's needed, but let's also look at the policies that they passed. They passed policies back and forth to change what's happening in our schools on a year-to-year basis. And by the time we get ready to implement something, they want to redo it and do it and try something new. And that keeps us constantly reinventing what's going on in the classrooms before we even know if it's working. We just passed a new literacy law last year that we were told, this is the one we think is going to work. And yet here we are before it's even implemented, and there's calls saying we need to try something else. And unfortunately, none of that is going to help kids if we aren't sticking the course in at least seeing what works and what doesn't instead of constantly flipping back and forth. So, again, I just say, yeah, we have problems in our schools. We're trying to do better, but unfortunately, Lansing is making that job significantly harder.
Kind of sticking with that line of thought, there does seem to be broad agreement that the state's children aren't reading as well as they should be. Literacy, I think, is one of the top things we're talking about when someone says, oh, schools are not performing well. There's broad disagreement, however, on who, if anyone, is to blame and what solutions could look like. So where does the K-12 Alliance stand on that? Do you think that schools can be doing more right now? What could solutions look like?
Schools can always be doing more, and that's what we are always looking at doing, is finding ways that we can better support these students. We know what works for students. The problem more often than not is our ability to have the people in the classrooms that we want there. Whether it's a lack of funding or lack of available people to fill those positions, it's making that job that much harder. But what we know works is those one-on-one additional supports, those reading coaches, the tutors. If we learned anything from the pandemic, it's those interventions that we can have with students, especially at a younger age, to get them caught back up with their class and where we want them to be. Those are the things that make the biggest difference in the success of our students inside of our classrooms. And unfortunately, when you're withholding a budget from schools, that means those positions aren't getting filled. And even if you give us a budget right now, those people that would fill those positions have already gone on to find something else to do. They aren't sitting around waiting for schools to get a budget and be able to hire them. They're gone. So for this upcoming year, the consequences are there. We're not going to be able to fill a lot of these positions that unfortunately are unfilled at this point. So, yes, schools can be doing much, much more. Schools want to be doing much, much more. But let's also look at what those scores are testing right now. If you're looking at the fourth grade reading from earlier this year, those scores, are they where we want them to be? Of course not. But who are those fourth graders? These are the students that were most directly impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. These are the students that were in kindergarten and first grade when schools were shut down. And we warned at the time that these students are going to need significant help to get caught back up, particularly in things like reading, because those are the things that we know kids learn best inside of a classroom environment, learning with their peers, learning with a reading coach in the classroom with them. They didn't have that. And so to just suggest that this is somehow a failure of schools, no, it's a failure of process in terms of allowing schools to have the resources and the personnel in place to help these students get caught up to where they need to be. So once again, I would say that Lansing has to look in the mirror and say, are we doing everything we can do to help these kids? And when you look at where we're sitting right now in early September and there is no budget, the answer is unquestionably no.
Well, Bob, thanks for joining us on MichMash. I do have to correct myself. It was 25 years ago that we got to know each other. I think the bottom line is just we've both gotten really old. But thanks again for joining us.
You're making us even older here, Zach.
I know. I'm sorry.